Welcome to this course, Green Economy from China's Stories. Now let's learn about the public supervision-based environmental policy. What is the public supervision-based environmental policy? It is a new type of environmental policy emerging in the 21st century. It's quite new. It promotes indirectly strict implementation of relevant environmental protection laws, regulations, and technical standards by means of social public opinions, social moral pressure, persuasion, and otherwise. The core of public participation instrument is that the environmental governance performance of the whole society will be influenced by public participation. The public can reflect their basic demands and positions on environmental policy issues to government departments through various channels. According to the ways and approaches of participation, public participation instruments can be divided into two categories. The first one is the government-led approach, including the release by government of environmental monitoring information of social concern, consultation, questionnaire survey, symposium, export demonstration meeting, hearings, and otherwise led by the environmental protection authorities. For example, the Supervision Center of the Ministry of Ecology and Environment and China National Environment Monitoring Center publish real-time monitoring results of air and water quality. Let's see the figure. The second one is the approach used by the public to actively reflect their own environmental protection demands. Citizens express their environmental protection demands by social media, letters, visits, and other methods. For example, they can report environmental violations to relevant departments through Weibo, WeChat, public accounts, mayor hotline, etc. Since the promulgation of the measures for the disclosure of environmental information in 2007, the Chinese government has implemented a series of top-down information disclosure and public participation policies with a view to attracting social forces into the environment governance system. Is it effective of this environmental policy? Researchers' analysis showed that NGO supervision-based or public supervision-based policy indeed have some effects. Then let's think about another interesting and important question. Do government departments really care about public supervision? Or is public supervision effective for pollution reduction? This is a good question. In recent years, Professor Zhang Bing from Nanjing University has constructed the Pollution Information Transparency Index, abbreviated as PITI. His research has answered this question. The results of his research show that NGO supervision-based policy in China to supervise and urge local governments to release emission reduction information may result in two kinds of effect. One is that it will increase public dissatisfaction with local governments if local governments' environmental protection is not transparent enough. The other one is that it will reduce the central government's supervision costs because the public supervise the local governments, so the supervision costs of the central government will be reduced accordingly. However, the research showed that, on one hand, the disclosure of the PITI has not directly affected the dissatisfaction degree of the public and the attention degree of the media. In other words, local governments adjust policies and improve environmental performance not out of public dissatisfaction, but out of their own demands. On the other hand, researchers have found through interviews that local government officials generally think that the pressure on environmental information disclosure from the central government has increased in recent years. Some city officials said that the disclosure of PITI increases the possibility of being supervised by the central government in respect of the city's relevant actions. In other words, the supervision by NGOs has become an effective supplement to the central government's supervision on local governments. What are the advantages and disadvantages of public supervision-based policy? The research finds that by participating in environmental governance, the public can reflect the needs and opinions of all levels of the society and organizations to the governance through different participation mechanisms. Thereby, the number of follow-up inspections and other activities conducted by the government decreases, conducting to the reduction of the government management costs. But the disadvantages are that public participation instruments have indirectly and a long-term lag in their effectiveness. The public participation instruments rely on the compelling force of administrative departments, the subsequent adjustments of relevant laws, regulations, and technical standards to achieve effects. Finally, let's look at the voluntarily-based policy. Voluntarily-based policy mainly refers to voluntarily-based spontaneous environmental protection actions by residents, enterprises, and civil organizations, according to their understanding of sustainable development, to reduce the consumption and waste of natural resources in production and daily life. In today's society, voluntarily-based environment policy is getting more and more popular in countries around the world. In terms of classification, resource-based environmental policy involves standard environmental management system for voluntary actions and voluntary environmental protection actions. For example, the ISO 41000 series of standards is a set of environmental management framework documents to promote the improvement of global environmental quality. The purpose is to strengthen the environmental awareness, management capacity, and the supporting measures of organizations, companies, enterprises, so as to improve the environmental quality. The earliest resource-based environmental policy in China appeared in 2003. Shandong Province People's Government and Jinan Iron and Steel Group Company Limited and Laiwu Iron and Steel Group Company Limited signed a voluntary energy conservation agreement, making the start of a voluntary agreement pilot in China. In the same year, 15 enterprises in Qingdao signed a voluntary energy conservation agreement with the local government. With regard to environmental management system and eco-label products, China established a national certification system for environmental management system in 1997. Although voluntary means is not an important means in China's environmental policies, new environmental policy instruments with voluntary and economic means as concepts have been adopted by more and more countries, becoming a new trend of environmental governance innovation. So, what are the characteristics of voluntariness-based environmental policy? First of all, the voluntarily-based environmental policy is not driven by laws or other compulsory means, but is formulated spontaneously by enterprises through internal agreements. In fields where the implementation costs of formal environment management rules are too high, the voluntary internal management by the managing part will be more efficient than the formal rules, and the transaction costs are lower. Therefore, voluntarily based environmental policy can reduce production costs. Voluntarily based environmental policy is the result of enterprises' response to the needs of consumers' competitive pressure from the external environment, new laws and regulations, and potential threats. The voluntarily based environment policy is based on the voluntary compliance by enterprises, but its operational efficiency is inseparable from relevant regulations and public supervision. China's voluntariness-based environmental policy roughly appeared in the late 1990s and early 2000s. As mentioned above, under strong local government-business relationship, enterprises may use voluntarily-based policy to communicate to the public that they are willing to reduce emission so as to gain public recognition. But actually, they do not take any action to reduce emissions. The voluntary means should be a self-regulation method before the government officially enacts legislation. This method is often combined with traditional legal instruments to make it more applicable. With the development of China's economy, in the face of increasingly complex environmental issues, single forcible means cannot deal with the environmental problems. Administrators hope to seek new management methods as supplements to mandatory policies to make up for their deficiencies. At the same time, enterprises' environmental protection awareness is rising, and they pay more attention to their own environmental performance. Public consumers also have higher requirements for their own environment and the products they consume. It means that it is necessary and possible for China to try and enforce voluntary environmental policies at this stage. In recent years, the dominated policies adopted by Chinese government have been changed. The command and control policy was dominated before the 1990s. Then, the dominated policy changed to market-based policy. The voluntarily-based and public supervision-based policies appeared after 2000 year. In general, the formulation of national environment policies should be prudent. We should not only consider the long-term strategy for sustainable development in harmony with the social and economic environment, but also pay attention to the immediate interests that enhance the country's international competitiveness and improve the living standard of the people. At the same time, operational feasibility shall also be considered. Therefore, the national environmental policy can only be constantly improved through confrontation and compromise. Any environmental policy is time-sensitive. When social conditions change, the policy may be partially or completely invalid. Therefore, on the premise of keeping the overall environmental policy relatively stable, the environmental policies also need to be adjusted in stages according to the specific circumstances at that time. Well, the specified classification analysis of environmental policy is finished. Thank you. See you next time.